Thanks for joining this webinar, Spotlight on Inter-Entity Trade for Sage 300. My name is Natalie from Orchid Systems, and today Anne and I are joined by Robert Lavery from Robert Lavery & Associates, Orchid's distributor in North America, for a presentation on inter-entity trade. Last month, we presented Spotlight on inter-entity transactions designed to automatically generate offsetting entries in each company based on highly configurable rules. Inter-entity trade is very often used in conjunction with inter-entity transactions to create reciprocal documents in Sage 300 when related entities trade products or services with each other. And this is what we're going to focus on today. We will look at some features and benefits of inter-entity trade, look at a detailed OE and PO trade example, including using OE and PO on the web screens. We'll then review some example case studies. We will share some setup tips for inter-entity trade and frequently asked questions around mapping fields, and look at using inter-entity trade, audit logs, and periodic processing. Finally, we will review how to use inter-entity trade with other Orchid modules, such as inter-entity transactions, extender, and document management link. Do you need inter-entity trade? The Inter-Entity Suite is designed to give you tight control over transactions spanning multiple entities in Sage 300, either within one database or multiple databases. It streamlines the processing and eliminates duplicate data entry. As a result, it increases the accuracy of your financial data, and accountancy staff who have implemented inter-entity trade report saving days of effort each month. So as we presented last month, inter-entity transactions is designed to automatically create the loan account entries, and it works with all general ledger subledgers, including banks. Inter-entity trade is in use when related entities trade products and services using order entry and purchase order and or accounts receivable and accounts payable, and the reciprocal documents are automatically generated. So if you manage multiple entities that trades goods and services with one another, and you have an increasing volume of inter-entity transactions that flow from your complex trading environments and organizational structures, you could save a lot of time by creating those reciprocal documents automatically. That removes the need for duplicate entries to be manually created and checked, and also improves accuracy and auditability. So inter-entity trade lets you initiate a transaction in one entity, and inter-entity trade does the rest. Transactions are entered once and replicated across companies. You configure the rules to set up to know how and what documents need to be created automatically. You map which information flows through from one document to another, which we'll look at. And it operates within one or across multiple Sage 300 databases, and includes comprehensive audit logging. So it supports multiple transaction types, such as mirroring your buy and sell transactions in AR, AP, and OEPO. It mirrors your receipt and payment transactions between AR and AP. So you can create a purchase order from a sales order, and there are flexible options, including bidirectional processing, meaning you can start a sales order in one company, which creates a purchase order in another entity, and then you can choose to receive that purchase order and automatically generate the order shipment in the other company. So some of the examples are in a situation where you have manufacturing company and a distribution company and a sales company, and they all buy and sell from each other. And ultimately, you start off with a purchase order from a customer. So you would create a sales order in your sales company, which triggers a purchase order for the distribution company, etc. And I will now hand over to Rob for the presentation.
This presentation reviews the functionality of the Inter-Entity Trade module from Orchid Systems. As you may be familiar, Inter-Entity Transactions is the module where you process intercompany entries through loan accounts that you create through the linked accounts, the due to, due from, loan accounts that we process in the general ledger. This supports expense allocations, revenue allocations, and also cash management entries where you wish to receive money on behalf of another company or make payments on behalf of another company, or manage the loan of cash between related party entities. And these are all cleared through loan accounts in the general ledger. But what happens when you want to buy and sell between related parties? This is where the inter-entity trade module comes in. Using inter-entity trade, we have the ability to create an AP invoice that creates an AR invoice in the same or a different Sage 300 company database, or vice versa. We can create an AR invoice, which then creates an AP invoice in the same or a different Sage 300 company. You can also process AP credits to AR credits and vice versa, or AP payments to AR receipts and vice versa. So it's possible to create AR to AP subledger-based transactions, so you actually have invoices that you can settle through payment transactions, as opposed to creating loan account entries that are settled by transferring money or just offsetting due to and due from accounts across one or multiple entities. In today's presentation, we want to highlight for you the use of OE trade to PO trade. This is where we can create an OE order that creates a purchase order in the same or different Sage 300 company databases. And all the other related transactions, such as OE shipment to PO receipt, or OE invoice to PO invoice. And this can be done in either direction. And in fact, as we create the relationship between these different companies or entities, you have the ability to not only go in one direction, OE to PO, but you can flag this relationship as being bidirectional. So what we find in practice is that many companies have a selling company and a manufacturing company. So what they do is they create a sales order in the source company to the ultimate end consumer, and the generation of that OE sales order creates a purchase order in the same company to buy the goods from the manufacturing company. And that PO, once it's created, then creates a sales order back to the source company for selling those goods to the company that is ultimately selling to the end consumer. So this is what we call an OE to PO to OE trade transaction. And this can be facilitated by creating the OE to PO relationship. And you notice that in this case, I'm creating the purchase order in the same company database. So when I make the sales transaction, it creates a purchase order in the same company to the company I want to buy the goods from. And then I can turn around and say that that PO document that's created is going to move over to the target company or the manufacturing company in this example. And that PO document will create the sales order document in Orc Inc. 2, which is a sales order back to Entity 1 or Orc Limited in this case. The system also allows us to use category overrides because some companies upon consolidation need to eliminate the intercompany profits. We can set up a special IC category to capture all of the intercompany profits on intercompany-based sales. You could also use a location override so that inventory that's being sold between related parties is also tracked through a different location. And you can also have a separate price list. Notice that you also have a cost multiplier to support transfer pricing, either at cost or at a markup. And then you can also override the transaction line tax so that you can determine which tax jurisdiction you would like to apply to these transactions. So once we have these related party trading partners set up as a relationship within the OEPO trade setup, we're now able to start creating transactions for purchase and sales in the scenario where you want to move inventory or drop ship inventory from the manufacturing company to the end consumer, but have the sale actually recorded in the first company, in this case, Orc Limited. So to set up the transaction, we're going to create a sales order in Orc Limited to our famous customer, Mr. Ronald Black. And we're going to use the ship via, which is just highlighting the fact that we can create a sales order and only certain lines are needing to be purchased from our related party. And what you see on the right-hand side is the document management link solution, which means I can also record a copy of the sales order and use that as a supporting document for the transaction audit trail. So I'm going to create a sales order in Orc Limited to Mr. Ronald Black. The description is going to be an intercompany sale and purchase. And this description can be part of what we call the integration settings that allows us to add to the audit trail information between the companies. So I'm going to create a ship via code for an inventory item, and I'm just going to choose the fluorescent desk lamp. And I'm going to have it be sold out of location 1. And let's say the order quantity is 10. And then I'll do a second line item. And this will be the item 105, which is the fluorescent lamp. And you notice the picture of the item coming up. That's Orchid Notes. And let's say this is an order of 5. Now, when I post this order, it's going to create the sales order in this company, which will then create a purchase order in this company over to Orc Inc. 2. And then it will go over to the Orc Inc. 2 database, and it will create a sales order in Orc Limited 2 back to Orc Limited. Now, I wanted to use the ship via code E2, which is the way that we're specifying that this is a transaction that needs to be recorded as an intercompany sale. So it would be possible to use the ship via code on a multi-line sales order where just some of these items were recorded as part of the intercompany sale and others were being replenished through the inventory in the company that's creating this initial sales order. So you can see that the description is entity 2, which identifies which entity that I want to buy from. So when I post the transaction, I get a request to approve because of the credit limit. And then I'm able to go ahead and post this sales order in Orc Limited, which will then create the purchase order in Orc Limited, which we'll show you, and then go over to create the sales order in Orc Inc. 2. So notice that we have order 89 created in Orc Inc. 2 against PO 52, and PO 52 was created in Orc Limited for order 119, which is what we'll see created right here. So there's order 119. That created purchase order 52 in this company, which then created the sales order in Orc Inc. 2. So now we come to the purchase order entry here in Orc Limited, and you can see that PO52 has been created in the same company off of the sales order 119, which was our original sales order. You can see that the description, intercompany sale and purchase, has been added. The company that the original sales order came from, and in this case, we've also added the user name. This is the PO that's created now to buy these items from Orc Inc. 2 in order to fulfill the sales order that we created to Mr. Ronald Black. Now we move over to Orc Inc. 2, and we see our sales order that has been created selling the goods back to Orc Limited. When we open up the order entry screen, we should see the reference to the original sales order. So here is order 89. And if I had added a document attachment, the original sales order 119 from Orc Limited would be shown in document management link. And I've got the information about the original sales order, the reference field, and the PO that's associated in Orc Limited to this sales order here in Orc Inc. 2. And again, the description, intercompany sale and purchase, the original sales order from Orc Limited, and the user who set that up. Now, this has got the two items, the quantity of 10 and 5. But if for some reason I needed to modify the order, and let's say the customer called, said they actually want 12, I could edit the order in Orc Inc. 2 or the PO in Orc Limited, and it will modify the quantity on all three documents automatically. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and post the fact that we've modified this order, and that will update the PO to a quantity of 12 for the first line item on the original PO 52, and also update the order 119 in Orc Limited as well. So now against this order in Orc Inc. 2, I want to ship all, and then I want to also create the invoice. And both the shipment and the invoice will be created here in order entry in Orc Inc. 2, which will then create the PO receipt and PO invoice in Orc Limited, which will create the shipment and OE invoice to the customer in Orc Limited. So now you see that the OE shipment 101 has created a PO receipt 122 in Orc Limited. And we've also created against that PO receipt an OE shipment 77 in Orc Limited. You also notice that OE invoice 90 has been created in Orc Limited for PO invoice 74, and that PO invoice 74 has created a sales invoice 74 in Orc Limited as well. So now we'll close out of this order here in Orc Inc. 2 and go back to Orc Limited to show you the transactions that resulted. So we start with the purchase order that was created here in Orc Limited off the original sales order. If you remember, that was PO 52. Now we can see receipt 122 has been created. If we move to the invoice entry, we will see that the invoice 74 was created against receipt 122. And I have a different series of invoice numbers here, so I need to go backwards to find that invoice number 74, which is right here. Notice a couple of things here. We have the original PO 52, the original sales order 119, the receipt 122, and the invoice 74 have all been created. And we updated the quantity from 10 to 12 on the sales order within Orc Inc. 2. That has now been updated for the quantity on the PO receipt and invoice here in Orc Limited. And now within order entry, we see that we have an invoice 74 that will be recorded against the shipment and the original order entry 119. So there's the reference to the PO invoice 74 and the order 119 against those items with the quantity of 12. So that amendment flowed all the way through the order entry to PO to OE, and we have now fulfilled the transaction on both companies without rekeying the information and having all of the documents prepared and produced automatically for us based on the original sales order. That's how inter-entity trade streamlines the transaction details for you quickly and easily. If you have any questions about this, we invite you to send those questions, and thank you so much for your time and attention today.
And just as Rob used the classic desktop to enter the OE sales order against Mr. Ronald Black, we can use the web screens as well. This is because inter-entity transactions and inter-entity trade work at the view level. And so the automation of the additional documents is all done at the view level. So entering a sales order against Ronald Black, using the same order description and using the same quantities, we're going to make the ship via E2 for both lines. And when the order is posted, the additional documents, the purchase order in Orc Limited is created and the sales order in Orc Inc. 2 is created. And the original sales order number is 112. Having a look at the purchase order, PO 61 is created, and you can see the purchase order description and the reference that it came from order 122. And connecting to Orc Inc. 2, in order entry, we can see the sales order that was automatically created. And again, we see the purchase order number, the original description, the user and the company it came from, and the reference being the original sales order number in Orc Ltd. And if we go ahead and change the quantity to 12, the purchase order and sales order in Orc Limited will be updated. And now if we go ahead and ship and invoice this sales order, the shipment and invoice will be created in Orc Inc. 2, and the PO will be receipted and invoiced in Orc Limited, and the original sales order to Ronald Black will be shipped and invoiced. So if we go back to Orc Limited, in PO, we can see the original purchase order is receipted. The receipt number is 118. And the quantity ordered has been updated to 12. And looking at the purchase invoice, we can see invoice 75 was for the original sales order 122. And the quantity invoiced is 12. And back against the original sales order for Ronald Black, we can see shipment 102 was created and invoice 92 was created.
Thanks, Rob and Anne, for your detailed presentations of inter-entity trade, focusing on OE and PO. So we've looked at an example where a sales order is created in the sales company that automatically creates a purchase order in the manufacturing company. The purchase order then creates the sale order in the manufacturing company's books. We've seen that we can view the supporting documents using Document Management Link across multiple entities. We've also seen an example of using the web screens for similar type of transactions where we are creating a sales order in company 1 to create a purchase order in company 1, which then triggers a sales order in company 2. And we've seen that we can ship and invoice, receive and invoice those sales orders and purchase orders in the various companies. We've demonstrated an example using Orchid sample data. But now let's look at a few use cases in practice. The fuel trading company in the Caribbean uses inter-entity trade for charging management fees, for intercompany fuel sales, for advances for travel expenses, and allocate rent expense and payroll expenses to various entities. And they also use it in conjunction with inter-entity transactions, actually. We have another example of a consumer packaged goods company that uses inter-entity trade for its 9 entities to transfer inventory between each other, to automatically record the funding between entities, to pay expenses on behalf of other entities, and receive monies on behalf of other entities. And using inter-entity transactions, they can manage intergroup promissory notes as well. So now let's look at some common support questions and some tips regarding setting up inter-entity trade. And we're going to start by looking at the frequently asked question page in the entity trade help. We won't cover all the points in this document, but we'll focus on a few particularly common ones, and we'll start with some tips for OE and PO trade. Can I map items between different databases in OE PO trade? So if my items in IC are not the same, is it okay? And yes, you can use the option called Use Item Mapping in trade options. Once you use it, you need to configure the item mappings for all the pairs in OE PO trade partners. So let's look at that in Sage 300. If I go to trade options on the OEPO trade options tab, I can see that I've selected the option to use the item mapping. So in OEPO trade setup, when I select an OE to PO pair, so in this example, ship via E2 to account 9002, I have my item mapping tab here, and I can list all the items with the source item number and the target item number. Even if they're the same, like in this example, you still need to configure it. So it is a little bit more extra work to set up and maintain if you don't have the same item numbers in the different databases, but it is possible. And if you don't see this item mapping tab in OEPO trade setup, go and check the trade options and make sure that use item mapping is selected. We've previously gone through how to map some fields between OE and PO transactions using the OE PO integration tab in trade options. And the common questions that we have is, can we synchronize the on hold field? Then the on hold field is a mapping option, so you can pass the on hold status from one source document to the target trade document. To synchronize the on hold status, if it changes in one of the related documents, you must also enable the option to allow the OE order to amend or delete the PO, or the option to allow the PO to amend the OE, depending on which way to go, and to do both if you're doing bidirectional trade. So if we look at this in Sage 300, so here we have our option to allow OE PO to amend and delete the PO, and allow PO to amend and delete the OE order. And on the OE PO integration tab, if I select the on hold field, you can see that we're already passing the order document on hold to the PO document on hold. If it wasn't around, it would be like this. Then I can come here on the left, select it to include it, and save the record. So what about optional fields? How do I synchronize optional fields between documents in OE and PO? Basically, there is no special mapping for this. If you want the optional fields from an OE order to flow through to the PO created by trade, you must use the same optional field names in OE and PO. So if it's defined at the same level, then the optional field is copied across. For example, if you have a source document, an OE order with an optional field called color, and the purchase order also has an optional field called color configured at the header level, then the optional field value will be copied between the source and the target document. If you have a detail optional field called color for the OE order, and the PO also has a detail optional field called color, then the value will be copied to the line in the target document. So we don't need to actually look at anything for that, because this is all configured in common services in optional fields. Can I transfer the currency exchange rate from the source transaction to the target transaction? Yes, you can. By default, it's set to using the default currency rate. So inter-entity trade will just push the detail of the transaction and let Sage 300 default in the target entity take over. But you have another option to use the user specified rate to force the exchange rate from the source document to the target document. So if we look at this in trade option, and this is a general option, it's not partner by partner. So here I can use the default currency rate or user specified rate. Okay, a really important option is, can I turn off messages in OE PO trade option? You've probably seen in the presentation that when we post an OE order and it creates a PO, we get a message on the screen with the PO number that was created. And this is really useful if you're processing everything on the Sage 300 desktop screens and you want to immediately see the PO or the OE order that's been created or updated, and go and check it in the other company or do something with it in the other company. But in some cases, you may want to turn off those messages, in particular if you are creating transactions, source transactions through third-party applications outside of the Sage 300 screens. because such processes can't respond to the message that shows up saying the transaction has been created, and it may make the screen appear to hang if the messages then remain open. If you are turning off messages, then you need to review the OEPO trade inquiry audit logs even more regularly. So let's look at this in trade options. So on the OEPO trade options tab, we have this option here, display notification messages. So you can either display all messages, or display errors only, or display no messages at all. Now let's look at some frequently asked questions for AP and AR. And the first one is a tip relating to posting AP payment batches. So can inter-entity be configured to auto-post AP payment batches? So yes, if you look at the trade options, we have an option here to configure inter-entity trade to auto-post the different types of batches that INCAD create. One thing to note though is that if you are trying to auto-post AP payment batches, and the batch that you end up creating is of type check, then it cannot be auto-posted because Sage 300 expects the checks to be printed. So if you need to auto-post AP payment batches, you need to select a vendor payment code that does not use a check payment type, or you leave the vendor default payment code blank and you choose a default payment code in AP setup options that doesn't use a check payment type. So you can see in this example, our 9002 vendor, which is used by inter-entity trade, has got a payment code of type EFT. And if we check that payment code, it's configured to other, so not a check one. Question that is maybe less common but is relevant in some cases is, can inter-entity trade create elimination entries when using AP/AR trade? And if there is an option in the AP/AR trade setup to create elimination entry, and in that case you select your elimination company, and then a GL entry will be created in the elimination company for each and every transaction created for this AP/AR trade partnership. If we look here at our AP/AR trade setup, you can see that I've selected create elimination entry, selected my elimination company, and then here where I'm mapping my GL accounts, I can select the GL accounts to use for the elimination entries if we need to map them. Does inter-entity trade always use the default tax classes in the target database? By default, inter-entity trade will take the main values in the source document and pushes them through to the target. And then the target company does its own processing on the values, such as adding tax to them, depending on the AP/AR setting for the vendor or customer. So by default, it doesn't send any tax information across. If you need to send tax details from the source document to the target document, you need to select the include transaction line tax in the AP/AR trade partner setup. So let's have a look at that. So here I can select to include the transaction line tax if required. As we've demonstrated, you can create AR receipts from AP payments and AP payments from AR receipts with inter-entity trade. Question is, does inter-entity trade apply AR receipts to the invoices when it's creating the receipts from AP payments? And basically, if all the invoices in the AP payment can be found in AP/AR trade audit or in OEPO trade audit, so they've been somehow linked to inter-entity transactions, then the receipt will be applied to the AR invoices. If an invoice cannot be found as having been processed through APAR trade, then the receipt will be set up as an unapplied cash receipt. Another frequent question is, does Inter-Entity support project and job costing? The answer is yes, it's supported on the individual APAR or OEPO trade partner setup. So you can select it for the trade partners that use project and job costing, but there is no mapping of contracts, projects, or activities. So Inter-Entity Trade assumes that the setup and codes used for the contracts, projects, or activities on the source transaction are the same as on the target transaction. Let's have a look at this in the APAR trade setup. And as you can see here on our trade partner, we can say include PJC fields. And that is the same on the OE and PO screen. Final question is, how do you enable the GL account expense to revenue account mappings in AP and AR trade? This section on the APAR trade screen is only enabled if you use account to account or distribution set mapping in IT trade options. So if you don't see the grid, you need to go and update the options. So let's look at that. First, if we look at our APAR trade setup, here we have this grid where we can map the GL accounts if they are different. And in trade options, we have this option here to say use account to account or distribution set mapping. So if this option is not selected, then the grid will not be available. So looking at our AR to AP trade partner here, we have a different example where we're actually allocating any revenue going to the 4210-1 GL account or to the 4210 GL account using a distribution set in the target company. So here I can select a distribution set, and for example, if I put it to the rent account, the rent distribution set, in Org IN2, so in my other company, my rent distribution set can actually split the expense to various GL accounts. So it lets you do one GL account in AR to multiple GL accounts in AP with just one line configuration. So that's also a really useful tip to set up inter-entity trade. And this is actually documented here in the help on the using distribution sets in inter-entity trade. We have an example setup and transactions, so I'll encourage you to have a look at that. We've seen various tips to set up inter-entity trade as documented in the FAQ section. For example, how to map some fields like the on-hold fields. When upgrading inter-entity trade, generally all you need to do is install and activate the new version. So when upgrading to 2024, you download, install and activate version 2024 of inter-entity. And then the last thing you need to do is generally resave all the passwords in trade organizations and database mappings, in particular with the changes in security with version 2024. And also a reminder to use the inter-entity trade audit logs and the periodic processing to check if there are any errors and reprocess any errors. So let's go and have a look at that quickly in Sage 300. So as mentioned, after an upgrade, we generally recommend that you come to Entity Database Mappings and re-enter the credential used for each database. And in Trade Organization Setup, this is where we set up the passwords that we need to connect to the databases. When using inter-entity, Under inquiries, you have your trade audit inquiries and your OEPO trade audit inquiries, and they are very useful to check that transactions have been created correctly, to check that transactions have been created, find the related party document number, and also see if you have any pending transactions or any transactions in error. So here I have one transaction in error. I need to check what it is, fix the underlying issue, and then I can go to periodic processing, and on the OEPO periodic processing, select what transactions I want to deal with. Generally, you're going to pick up transactions in error, and you might do them all, or just OE to PO, or just PO to OE. If I'm just doing just OE to PO orders, I can select one particular transaction. And sometimes if you're asking us a question about a specific transactions, we will ask you to record the RV SPI while running the trade periodic processing. And that's a very useful tool for troubleshooting documents in error in inter-entity trade. Finally, let's have an overview of inter-entity trade working with other Orchid modules. We've touched on that in this presentation. We have demonstrated this in other videos, but just a reminder that inter-entity trade is very commonly used in conjunction with inter-entity transactions. For example, to work together with AP and AR reallocation. Many companies use Extended Developer and scripts or some apps from the marketplace in conjunction with trade, for example, to print OE and PO documents automatically when transactions are created. So the PDF is saved in a configured folder, optionally emailed to the vendor as the documents are being created by inter-entity trade. We can also configure document management link to view documents saved only once against one entity and display them in another entity. And there is a separate video just highlighting how to do this and how this works. Thank you very much for your time, and for more information on inter-entity trade, you can visit our website www.orchid.systems and select the entity trade page. There are also some brochures, videos, case studies, training guides, online help, and other technical resources. We're now open for questions.